Thank you. And I'm going to actually present in English. Most of my sources that I'm citing are text by scholars from Spain that teach at British universities and so publish in English. So a lot of the terminology is in English as well. So the recent boom of Spanish exploitation, and I'm going to focus on director, actor, screenwriter Paul Naschy. As streaming has become the preferred means of viewing series and feature films on televisions and personal devices, physical media, DVDs, HD, 4K Blu-rays, have ceased to be an option for most. Just this year, Best Buy has announced that they will no longer sell home video, and Netflix has officially ended its DVD, Blu-ray mail service. While the discs certainly take up space, many collectors prefer to own films that are extremely rare or important to them, or that may not be available to stream in high quality. Additionally, as I recently learned, users only own the streaming file as long as the provider, Vudu, Amazon, Disney, stays in business or owns the rights to the film. For example, I purchased the film Los Girasoles Ciegos several years ago on Prime for my students, but Amazon no longer has the rights, so I no longer have what I paid for. It's very sad. Auteur, or high quality, quote, high quality cinema from Spain, has been available only sporadically in the US, largely for specific directors such as Saura, Buñuel, Berlanga, Almodóvar, or Boyain, through labels such as Criterion. However, in recent years, boutique labels from the US have begun releasing deluxe editions of works from some of Spain's most marginalized and shunned directors of the 1970s and 80s, which include Paul Naschy, Jesus or Jess Franco, Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, José Ramón Larraz, Eloy de la Iglesia, or Armando de Osorio. In 2017, Andy Willis explained the popularity of actor/director Paul Naschy as a cult film star rather than a traditional one who owes his fame to horror fanzines and fan websites. Fans congregate on Facebook and on the Mark of Naschy website, and the podcast, Naschycast, now has 72-hour episodes, so 120-minute episodes, archived on the topic on his body of work. His earliest films were originally more popular outside of Spain, perhaps due to the fact that they were heavily censored domestically. Even though his movies were Spanish products, filmmakers were required to claim a setting outside of the peninsula, use non-Spanish actresses, and eliminate excessive violence and nudity, except in the international versions. The boutique labels have released a total of 25 Naschy films on Blu-ray and 4K between 2015 and 2023. These high-resolution films are not available on streaming sites, so these editions maintain a certain level of exclusivity. With the exception of Jesus Franco, it appears that Paul Naschy has more films on the market and the largest fan base of any Spanish film figure within the US. With a sharpened focus on popular culture in Spanish cinema, it is essential that we analyze the current appeal, reception, and relevance of the oft-discredited and ostracized film genre of fantasy and terror, or fantaterror, as dominated by Naschy. Boutique labels tend to be a labor of love. They are small companies with little staff who market their products to fan communities similar to those that collect vinyl records or comic books. They frequently package the discs with many extras such as booklets, posters, slipcovers, additional interviews and commentaries, outtakes, documentaries, or even a soundtrack CD. There are often gimmicks such as selling limited numbers of certain editions or packaging films as bundles. The different labels have social media pages where they interact personally with collectors who will post photos of their purchases along with reviews and requests. While companies such as Criterion, Kino Lorber, or even Warner Archive are hardly small businesses, it is the smaller labels that offer more personalized fare. While several labels have ceased to exist after only a few years, new companies are constantly emerging or marketing themselves in new ways. For example, Kino Lorber has just shut down its streaming site for cult films, opting to release the movies as physical media. Their first release, a little over a month ago, was Jesus Franco's Lorna the Exorcist. And you can see they're very over-the-top film covers that emphasize the sex and violence. So I won't let that stay too long. But that's their very first release that they thought, they should have. According to Brian Rafferty of Wired Magazine, the, quote, Blu-ray renaissance on boutique labels started in at least 2018. For me, it is akin to the disappearance of vinyl records in the retail stores of the 1990s, where they became more sought after in specialty shops and mail-order catalogs among a fan culture of collectors. The genres of fantasy and terror, or fantaterror español, were lambasted or fervently rejected by contemporary critics during the 1970s. The genres nearly disappeared completely in the 1980s and early 90s, but we witnessed the rebirth of the horror film in Spain later that same decade. Its continued success is apparent even now with the second season of the series 30 Coins on HBO, directed by Alex de la Iglesia and released just a couple of weeks ago. Certain critics in Spain began an initial reappraisal of these films with 1999's Week of Cine Fantástico y de Terror in San Sebastián. While working as director of Spain's National Library, Luis Alberto de Cuenca presented an essay at this conference titled Paul Naschy, Man of a Thousand Faces, thus linking him to famed actor Lon Chaney for the number of different characters he represented throughout his film career. The same author compared Naschy to the dog in Goya's painting. The current that the current that he swims against is that of the Spanish film industry, particularly those who have insisted on realism and those that have censored his work, either by cutting offensive scenes or by refusing to provide funding. It is worth noting that, end quote, it is worth noting that Naschy never received government subsidies for any of his films. And here he is. Paul Naschy, 1934 to 2009. His real name, of course, is Jacinto Molina Alvarez. He started what is denominated the golden age of Spanish cine fantástico with his 3D film, La Marca del Hombre Lobo, 1968, which was titled Frankenstein's Bloody Terror in the US, despite the fact that there's no Frankenstein monster, it's a werewolf movie. Today, this film has been declared the holy grail for fans of 3D film restoration, and there is a fan culture around 3D home video. Although the negative of this film is preserved in the Madrid Filmoteca, the owner will not allow access to it. So this is the American Hollywood film poster and the DVD, which is available in Spain, but not in the US, and the 3D film is sitting in an archive rotting away. This genre of cinema peaked with its three most successful films, Narciso Ibáñez Serrador's La Residencia, which in English is also known as The House That Screamed or The Finishing School from 1969, which was restored and released on Blu-ray this summer by Arrow Video. Jess Franco's Count Dracula starring Christopher Lee from 1970, whose negative was discovered earlier this year in the same film archive. A new 4K edition will be released in December next month. And the third film is La Noche de Valpurgis, or in English it was called Werewolf Shadow or The Werewolf versus Vampire Woman, 1971, with Paul Naschy as screenwriter and featured actor. The immediate source of inspiration for Paul Naschy, both thematically and aesthetically, was German Expressionism, the universal horror films of the 1930s and 40s, and the UK Hammer films that followed. Nevertheless, feeling forgotten and unappreciated from 1980 until the end of his life in 2009, he often claimed that he really did not have any influences and that his work was original and based only on life experiences. Naschy also advocated for himself in his 1997 autobiography, Memoirs of a Wolfman, which you can see here in English, translated into English in 2000 by Mike Hodges. He insisted that he had not been merely a character actor in genre films, but that he should be considered a true auteur, as someone with a distinct personal style who usually wrote or directed the films in which he appeared. Naschy also highlighted his connections to the intellectual world that had summarily dismissed his work. His uncle, Jacinto, same name, had introduced him to the world of Gothic Romanticism as they roamed together through cemeteries in Madrid. His other uncle, Emilio, was a painter and sculptor who was personal friends with important writers such as Pío Baroja, Wenceslao Fernández Flores, painters such as Dalí and Gutiérrez Solana, and the author film director Edgar Neville, among others, and was able to introduce a young Jacinto Molina to them. He also highlighted the influence of writers such as Lovecraft, Poe, Becker, Maupassant, Le Fanu, and Victor Hugo as painters such as Bruegel the Elder, Vermeer, and Bosch, in addition to Gutiérrez Solana for his aesthetic. And this is a a painting that he uses quite a bit in his films. And then, of course, the Solano paintings that look similar to a lot of Goya's work. Nevertheless, Naschy stated that, quote, none of the other directors who made cine fantástico, such as Ibáñez Serrador, Piquer Simón, Amando de Osorio, Jesus Franco, ever called me, because I would have overshadowed them. Although Osorio recently said, quote, that out of all those that made horror films in Spain, I was the most important and influential figure. No one had accomplished even half of what I have. Several Hollywood directors such as John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Tarantino, and novelist Stephen King have expressed admiration for Naschy's work, and he would often bring this up to counteract his lack of recognition in Spain in the 1990s. According to Naschy, quote, it has been said that it was much easier to know Spain through my films than from those of Carlos Saura. Mine were much more direct, with sexual frustration, religious topics, violence, etc. Starting with the 1976 film Inquisition, Naschy began directing most of his own films because, as he stated, no one was calling him for parts. He added, correctly, that the majority of his fans prefer the films that he directed over the ones where he merely acted and or wrote the script. Quote, the only thing I ask is that some of the films that I truly cherish and that required more effort on my part are preserved, that they are not lost. These films directed by Naschy have only been restored and released within the last decade by labels such as Mundo Macabro and Shout Studios in the United States and Ediciones 79 in Spain, out of Barcelona. On Halloween 2023, Mundo Macabro began taking pre-orders for a new 4K restoration of his film Dr. Jekyll vs. the Werewolf from '72, with both domestic or clothed and export or unclothed versions, with extras such as interviews with Naschy and others involved with the film. It is limited to only 2,000 copies and is nearly sold out in less than a week. The company Profilmes made double versions of many of its films, including those of Naschy. The versions that were exported included additional or alternate scenes of sex and or violence, at least until 1977 when the censorship laws ended. So, sorry, that's the film. On the new Blu-ray releases of Naschy's films, these scenes are featured as added attractions, or the disc contain both international and domestic versions of the films. Spain's cinema fantaterror was seen in the United States during the 1970s, either on television or in exploitation or grindhouse drive-ins and cinemas. In 2015, Edinburgh University Press published David Church's essential text, Grindhouse Nostalgia, Memory Home Video and Exploitation Film Fandom. He outlines the ongoing life cycles of these films, first through VHS release in the 1980s, television, and then DVD labels such as Sinister Cinema or Something Weird Video, that frequently filled discs with extras but were unable to improve picture quality or resolution. He describes how, with the home video market, quote, the sudden ability to choose from a wide range of exploitation titles and to apply a variety of reading strategies to them over subsequent reviewings encouraged the growth of fan cultures that became fresh markets for the films as cult objects. These fan cultures took up the mantle of researching, archiving, and assigning value to a wide swath of cinema history that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by film historians, high-minded critics, and various arbiters of cultural taste. The Naschy films released in high definition on home video in the US are from the now defunct labels Scorpion Releasing, Code Red, Full Moon Features, and the active Vinegar Syndrome and Kino Redemption. More importantly, the label Shout Factory released 10 remastered films by Naschy on Blu-ray in 2017, and Mundo Macabro has released 7 films, all of which were directed by Naschy between 1976 and 1993. And these, they all have a limited edition and a retail edition, and the limited edition tends to have a more scandalous cover, and are sold in limited editions. And then these are the editions that have just started coming out in Spain by Ediciones 79. Naschy appeared, and this last one only has an edition of 100 copies, so all for the collectors. Naschy appeared in around 100 films, and there are Blu-rays for 27 of them in the US, including 6 of his 12 werewolf films. 3 Naschy-directed films that have only been released recently are The Frenchman's Garden, The Devil Incarnate, and The Beast and the Magic Sword. As with other films in his repertoire, these will also become more widely appreciated and recognized, as many will be seeing them for the first time, especially in their remastered form. And so I had hoped to give summaries, but due to time, we'll skip those. But I refer you to Troy Howarth's book, Human Beast, which give summaries and commentary for all 100 of his films. Sorry, I'm going to exclude that. I'm going to go straight to the conclusion. So in the text, Historia del Cine Español, edited by Ramón Gubern, among others, in the year 2000, for the publisher Cátedra, there is barely any mention of Jacinto Molina at all, Paul Naschy. I'm sure you've never read him in any of your anthologies of cinema, even though, you know, he's arguably the most popular director. I'm not saying the best, but you know, selling the most films in the United States. There are 3 paragraphs that only state that the Western was substituted in Spain by the domestic horror film, which started with 1967's La Marca del Hombre Lobo and the 1961 film by Jess Franco, Gritos en la Noche. According to Juan M. Company, a contemporary critic in 1974, the horror subgenre is, quote, a deficient formal structure whose essential elements find themselves in a state of chaos, uncontrolled in the least by the film's directors. For Gubern, quote, the Spanish horror films merely took the model of the superior universal classics from the 1930s and 40s and used them as an excuse to test the boundaries of tolerance towards eroticism in film at that point in time. The popularity of these films, especially abroad, this is still part of the quote, the popularity of these films, especially abroad, was a lifeline to producers that were not benefiting from state subsidies and tried to somehow stay afloat in the industry, even with very small budgets, end quote. While certain directors such as Jorge Grau, Eugenio Martín, or Vicente Aranda dabbled in the genre during the height of its popularity, Paul Naschy cannot be accused of a lack of dedication to these films. For the period following 1982, the authors of the same history of Spanish cinema state that, quote, directors as prolific in the previous decade, such as Jesus Franco or Paul Naschy, were now ostracized, or their volume of output was drastically reduced. This was largely due to the so-called Miró law, which started in 1983 and favored realist cinema, particularly if it was based on works of literature or matched the sentiments of the current political mood in Spain. Despite the temporary moribund state of the genre during the late 1980s and early 1990s, many Spanish horror and fantasy films continued to appeal to international audiences. In particular, many of those that featured Paul Naschy as an actor and or director or scriptwriter. Henry Bacon cites Jeffrey Goldstein from Why We Watch to explain the possible appeal of fantasy in Spain at the time and abroad. Quote, immersion in fantasy fiction yields significant pleasure. It offers the possibility of detaching oneself from everyday life concerns and enables satisfying imaginary needs such as romance, excitement, and heroism. Sensations offered by the depiction of ruthless, unrealistic violence intensifies this experience and may cause highly pleasurable arousal. This effect can be so rewarding that repeating the experience becomes a source of further pleasure, end quote. When we reappraise cinema or literature after several decades, it is frequently due to the influence it has had on later works. With the enormous popularity of Spanish horror over the last 25 years, the important legacy of 70s fantaterror is undeniable. Current Spanish filmmakers agree that the principal visionary of that period was Jacinto Molina Alvarez, aka Paul Naschy.